Hey, 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 welcome back to Permission to Shine, your podcast dedicated to highlighting the most humble, inspiring personal stories that I know you guys will love. It's your host, Andrew Nemani. Welcome to 2024. Let's get it poppin'. I love it. We all made it. Congratulations. Now it's time to make it count. One thing that I've done for the last 3 years is I pick one goal for the year that I'm going to maniacally focus on for the entire year. That's the one thing that matters most to me. And my goal is that one thing then becomes a habit. After focusing on it for 365 days, it's now just ingrained in my behavior. So in the past, I've picked things like being present. So I quit multitasking, right? If I'm on a call, I'm not going to be texting somebody else. I'm totally focused, totally present, and really in the moment too, right? Like not thinking about, oh, how is this conversation I'm having now going to play out down the road? Rather, I'm just focusing on that current conversation. So it was really fun to train that muscle. Certainly wasn't easy, and something that I have to fight on every single day. Another thing I was focusing on is service, right? I'm in my 20s and I felt like at this point in my life, like you pour a lot into yourself, right? Because you're growing professionally and personally. And I was like, man, I'm forgetting to pour into others. That's super important to me. So I joined a nonprofit that focuses on development work in Nepal, a country that I've fallen in love with. So I joined the board there and I've gotten really involved with it. So those are two things I focused on in the past. This year, I want to focus on the one thing, and it's going to be slowing down and meditating. I feel like my mind's kind of gotten, all over the place with a lot of things. So I'm really excited to dive in, to just be calm and just find that stillness, at least the mental stillness, not physical stillness, but mental stillness. And I'm going to do that through meditation. Europe was absolutely amazing. Getting to experience that with my family was such a huge blessing and honor. Absolutely enjoyed it. We got to go to London and Paris both. Incredible time. So fun to just get out there, get perspective, get yelled at by the locals because we're dumb foreigners. So that's always a fun time. Let's transition to today's guest. An amazing man that I felt super lucky to sit down and have a conversation with. Imagine this with me. Being the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia when 9/11 happens, knowing that multiple of the terrorists came through Saudi Arabia. Our guest today did exactly that. He was President George Bush's personal attorney and good friend. And then when Bush got elected to be president, he called Bob Jordan and said, hey, Bob, I want you to serve as my U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And so after a lot of thought, Bob said, I'll do it. And went over to Saudi Arabia, was the ambassador. And the stories, the lessons that he learned are incredible. And I cannot wait for you guys to hear them. So I don't want to hold on any longer. Let's jump into it. Guys, 2024, find your one thing, focus on it for the next 365 days, enjoy it. Thank you for being a listener of Permission to Shine. I'm going to bring you the best guest in 2024. And today is an example of that. Please enjoy my conversation with U.S. Ambassador Robert Jordan. Ambassador Robert Jordan, welcome to the show.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited. It's a huge honor to sit down and to kind of pick your brain and your experiences.
Super.
How does Bob Jordan grow up or at least born in Wichita, Kansas, and then become personal friends with President George Bush?
Well, Wichita was very brief. This was toward the end of World War II. My dad was in the Navy, and he had been at Normandy. And then he was transferred to Hawaii to prepare for an invasion of Japan. So my mother's parents lived in Wichita. My family had lived in Tulsa. And so she went up from Tulsa to Wichita for me to be born. Thankfully, my dad got leave just as I had been born, so he was able to come home. But we really spent most of my childhood in Tulsa, with the exception of 2 years when I was ages 3 to 5. And that's when we moved to Peru for a couple of years. So that was my first international experience.
Culture shock?
For me, I was just a kid, so I remember having my third birthday in a hotel in Lima. And they brought in a birthday cake, but they couldn't get icing, and so they put whipped cream on it, which I did not like at all. Apparently, I threw quite a fit, which my mother reminded me of for many years.
So you go from Peru. Was it because your dad was doing business?
Yeah, he was in the international oil field supply business. So shipping, equipment back and forth was sort of his specialty.
Yeah.
And so he had a job for a 2-year contract, basically, to go to Peru, and then came back to Tulsa. So we spent most of my childhood then in Tulsa. And then my dad again took a contract to go to Hong Kong. while I was in college. So I got to spend one summer in Hong Kong as a 20-year-old.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
You take it Hong Kong or Peru?
Oh, I'll take Hong Kong anytime.
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
It seems like a pretty cool place.
Yeah, it was.
That's amazing. So did you have like big aspirations when you were growing up? Were you pretty driven?
Yes, I was a driven student, certainly. And I took international relations pretty seriously. I can recall watching our black and white TV and seeing some of the United Nations debates with our ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, and then Adlai Stevenson, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all that, too.
Mm-hmm. And then you went on to become an attorney, like a trial attorney specifically.
Yeah.
What kind of trials were you doing?
It was all business litigation. So I started out mostly doing antitrust work, and I had several cases around the country in which I was the junior lawyer. It was really a pretty cool experience. I had a case in San Francisco, and it was a huge case with many defendants, and we would have defense counsel meetings once a month. Well, my senior partner didn't want to go to those meetings, so he assigned me to go. And that's back in the days when even junior lawyers could fly first class. So I'm sitting up in first class, I'm having dinner, I'm having a few drinks. I look over, and who is sitting across the aisle from me but Mickey Mantle?
Wow.
So I debate, do I say hello? What do I do? Finally, I lean over and I say, "You're Mantle Mickey, aren't you? I'd sure like your autograph." He kind of rolled his eyes and gave me a baseball card.
Nice.
Yeah.
You made it happen.
Yeah. So that was my early days as a young lawyer.
That's cool. When does President Bush enter the scene for you?
Well, I had morphed into doing a lot more securities litigation, and my firm represented T. Boone Pickens in a lot of his takeover litigation.
Mm-hmm.
And we also represented the Harvard Endowment. And the Harvard Endowment had invested in a company in Texas called Harken Energy. And so in about 1991, Harken got notice that they were being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. And the investigation centered on potential insider trading by one of the directors of Harken, namely a guy named George W. Bush. And so they hired me to represent Harken and Bush. And it was clear that Bush was the focus, and so that's what I spent the next 2 years working on almost full time.
Wow.
Finally convinced the SEC that they had no case, and so they gave up. But it became an issue in Bush's campaign for governor, which he was undertaking in 1994.
So we're sitting in your office right now at your home, and I'm curious how you go from being his lawyer, helping represent him, to then you're like these pictures behind you.
Yeah.
You're sitting in his home.
That's in Crawford.
With his wife.
Yeah.
How? Not many people can do that.
Well, it was fortuitous. We just, of course, hit it off while I was representing him. And at that time, he was the president of the Texas Rangers Baseball Club. And so we would go to baseball games together. I have a picture somewhere of he and me together at a game in about 1993, I think. And we would spend the night with him in the governor's mansion when he was elected governor. And I would advise him on mostly state judicial appointments back in those days. So he then runs for president, and he was elected. And I called him on his cell phone to congratulate him. And I got his voicemail. So he then called me back and got my voicemail. And I still have the tape somewhere. And it said, "Hey, Bob, this is George," or I guess I should say President-elect Bush, returning your call. So he was no longer George from that point. And we got to talking about what I might do in his administration. Then finally, in about April of 2001, I got a call from the White House saying the president wanted me to be his ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So that's how that unfolded.
And then you became the second most powerful person in Saudi Arabia, 25th U.S. ambassador.
Yeah, it was not something I really wanted to do, quite frankly. And I took about 3 weeks to think about it. And my son was home from college at the time, one of my sons. And he said, "I know, Dad, you're having a hard time with this, but I think I know what you've decided to do. When your friend, the President of the United States, asks you to serve the country, you're not going to say no, are you?" And I said, "No, you're right. I'm going to do it."
Wow.
And of course, this was long before 9/11. And I was being mentored by my law partner, Jim Baker. and discussed with Jim quite a bit whether I should do it or not. He thought it was a terrific assignment. Then after 9/11 hit, he was even more, in a way, excited for me that it was an opportunity to really have an impact. And if you're going to serve your country, that's a tremendous opportunity to serve your country.
Oh my gosh. So when you first get the honor of being nominated for that position, what do you think the main objectives are in front of you?
Well, the Arab-Israeli conflict was rampant at that time. What was called the Second Intifada was raging. And I went to Crawford to talk with President Bush.
And can you remind the listeners the context of Crawford?
Crawford is his ranch, which is about an hour outside of Waco, Texas, in sort of central Texas.
Gotcha.
And about a 2.5-hour drive from Dallas. And so I went to see him to get an idea of the priorities that he wanted for me to address. And we talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and he basically said, there isn't much I can do about that right now. He said President Clinton had spent much of his second term trying to reach peace between the parties, and it just completely blew up. And so he said, until I see that I've got partners for peace on each side, the Palestinians and the Israelis, there isn't a lot I can do. If they get close, I can come in and try to get a deal closed. And so our view was that was not going to be a major part of what he wanted to be involved in. But the relationship with the Saudis was beginning to sour a little bit because they were angry that he had not intervened. The Saudis thought that a U.S. president was so powerful he could simply dictate to Israel what the terms of a reconciliation would be. And of course, many U.S. presidents had failed at that. So we were looking at economy, terrorism, extremism, and the oil markets as the main areas that I would address. Mm-hmm. And little did we know, of course, that Osama bin Laden would attack on September 11th.
Oh my gosh. And then the position changes drastically.
It changed. My life changed dramatically. The president had announced my selection as ambassador in the summer of 2001, but you don't really send in a formal nomination until all the security clearances are done and the paperwork is done.
Mm-hmm.
So the plan was to submit the formal nomination to the Senate on September the 7th, but for some reason the White House counsel's office lost the paperwork, and it was rescheduled to be submitted on September the 11th. Well, of course, it didn't happen that day, but it was then submitted on September the 12th.
Oh my God.
So the press jumps on it saying, well, now that we've been attacked by Saudis, the president's finally gotten around to nominating somebody to be the ambassador, when in fact the record is really clear. He'd been working on this since, I think, June of 2001.
When President Bush got elected,
Mm-hmm.
what's that like to have your friend elected to the most powerful position in the world?
Well, it was a real joy to me because I have so much respect for him as a person. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of loosely been a middle-of-the-road Republican, I guess, but I had not been that heavily involved in his campaign. I did work in his campaigns for governor, but I had not been that active in his presidential campaign. I gave him kind of the minimum contribution.
Mm-hmm.
But I was really pleased that someone of his integrity, of his vision for the country, and his stability would be elected. So I was really fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
Very proud of him.
I'm sure you were.
Yeah.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
And I meant when you're president, like you have to put off this certain image, right? And I think we always wonder as Americans, like how much of that is manufactured and really thought through. These are very intelligent people. So the image that we get to see of President Bush, how does that compare to who he is behind closed doors?
That's a great question, and it's quite different. And I had seen him in both formal and informal circumstances for quite a number of years by that point. He's very decisive. He's very smart. And in every meeting I attended, he was very well prepared. A lot of people thought that he was sort of being pushed around by other members of the administration. In fact, I'll give you an example. I went in to see him one time when I was in Washington. I go into the Oval Office, he asked me, he said, how do the Saudis like Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State? And I said, well, they like him a lot, but they think Cheney and Rumsfeld are running the show. And he whirled around and pointed at me, and he says, you tell them I'm running the show. You could tell this was a very tender subject for him because he'd heard it a lot, I'm sure.
And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Do you and Bush have nicknames for each other?
Well, he did for me. He has nicknames for a lot of his sort of close associates and senior staff. For example, Karl Rove, his advisor on politics, was called Turd Blossom. Dan Branch was called Branchy, and his name for me was Jourdan.
Jourdan.
Sort of like Louis Jourdan, the famous French actor.
Uh-huh. That's endearing.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're going to go to Saudi Arabia. You're like a trial attorney leading up to that, obviously very involved with government and doing it quite well at a high level. Like, what kind of training do you get to go over there?
During the time before my formal nomination, I was still going to Washington almost every week for a couple of days. And I'm meeting with think tanks, with government agencies, with military people. And so all of this is giving me a background in the country and what it is about to be an ambassador. And then once your security clearance has gone through, they have what's called the ambassadorial seminar. And that's a 2-week course that ambassadors and their spouses go through. There are about, I think, 10 politically appointed ambassadors and 10 career ambassadors, at least there were in my particular class. The Washington Post ran an article about it at the time. They called it Charm School 101, but it was quite the opposite. It was really a very dense series of lessons and lectures and readings on how to run an embassy, what the ethical obligations are, what the reporting obligations are. How do you, if you dissent from something you're being asked to do, how do you do that? What do you do in an emergency? They even took us down to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to visit the Special Operations Forces down there.
Were you excited or nervous to go there?
Oh, I was kind of excited in a way. I mean, this was pretty cool stuff.
Sounds intriguing.
And so,
did I go?
they were going to take us out to the range where they showed us tank warfare, and we would have these tanks sort of simulating tank attacks.
This is why your wife is like, no, Bob.
Right. And then they took us in a bus over to a firing range, and just at that moment, as we were going down this road, there's an explosion in front of the bus, and it was essentially a simulated terrorist attack. So terrorists come onto the bus, take us hostage, and then you hear this whir of helicopters, and 2 helicopters come in. American commandos rappel by ropes off the helicopters into the bus, fire simulated shots at the terrorists, and save us. And they were basically showing us how we can be rescued if we are kidnapped. There was a great concern about being kidnapped or other kinds of violence that might be inflicted on an embassy. So it was, I think, designed to reassure us. And these guys are pretty good at it.
That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, so you get to Saudi Arabia, and what's life like there?
Initially, of course, since 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis, my first task was to figure out, are the Saudis friend or foe? The government was saying all the right things, but we didn't quite know how far the resentment against the United States and potential violence extended, whether there were other al-Qaeda cells that were planning further attacks on either our embassy or the U.S. homeland. And so I made a point of meeting some of the most senior Saudi royals to figure out what they would say. And so I went to see Prince Salman, who was the governor of Riyadh and I think third in line to the throne at that time. He's now the king. But at the time, I asked him, how could it be that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis? And he said, oh, no, there were no Saudis involved in these attacks at all. This was the Israelis. And this became a mantra for them. Anything wrong with the world at that time was the fault of Israel in their eyes. So I went then to see the Minister of Interior, and I asked him the same question. He gave me the same answer. It was the Israelis. Finally, it wasn't until I was able to meet with the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Saud al-Faisal, whose father had been king earlier, and he got it. He was a Princeton graduate. He spoke better English than I did, and he was very clear that they had an extremism problem in their midst. They needed our help to root it out, and they had to turn a corner. And so he became a great ally in our counterterrorism activities after that point.
Mm-hmm. The language barrier, is that a real thing?
Not so much with the senior people I dealt with, at least Prince Saud certainly, but the king, the crown prince who was really running the country, Crown Prince Abdullah, and most of the other cabinet members would always speak in Arabic when I was there. Now, I had not been able to go to language school, which an ambassador normally does, but because of 9/11, they made a deal that they would give me a quick confirmation hearing only on the condition that I didn't stay around for language training and I went straight to my post. And the person who made that deal was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, Joe Biden.
The language thing is interesting to me. Like, this dawned on me. Can you always trust translators?
I trusted my own.
So you'd bring yours?
Oh, yes. And they would have theirs.
Got it.
And
is that a real thing, though? Like corrupt translators?
It's not so much corrupt as it is nuances or inflections of particular words. And so I had a number of meetings where either my translator or another translator would say, no, you didn't get that quite right when you were giving me the translation. And so they would confer and sort out what any distinction there was that needed to be made.
Got it.
And I also had note takers. And so we were very meticulous in getting the right translation and the right notes taken.
Yeah. Okay. So you were able to confirm that 15 of the 19 terrorists came through there?
Well, we confirmed that domestically and then presented the evidence to the Saudis. I think we had somebody from the CIA come out and actually show them forensic evidence and passport information and so forth.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
How would you classify Saudi culture?
In those days, again, this is 20-some years ago now, it was very restrictive. And yet at the same time, they have enormous affection for their families. They have an understanding of what family means. And if you go into an individual Saudi's home, they are the best hosts in the world. They will treat you literally as a guest. And in their view and their religion, it is commanded that you give proper hospitality to a guest. And if you're a guest, you're under their protection and their responsibility. And they take that very seriously. But as an overall culture, certainly in the first year I was there were extremists shooting, occasional Westerners driving cars at intersections in Riyadh and other places. It was a pretty dangerous place for a while. The Saudis got control of it ultimately. They were somewhat in denial about the presence of extremists, as I mentioned earlier. But we finally were able to work with them and gain their cooperation. And I have to give our counterterrorism people tremendous credit for earning that trust. But we then worked very successfully in helping them root out a lot of al-Qaeda cells and also going after terrorist financing, which was a huge issue in Saudi.
Mm-hmm. And obviously women's rights.
Yeah.
A big deal there.
And all of that was a reason why I was very reluctant to take the job in the first place. I mean, had great intolerance, no religious freedom, no women's rights, and just a complete negative view of the outside world.
Yeah.
Wanted their own kingdom. They view themselves as almost the Vatican of Islam, and they really did not want outside interference. They didn't want a Western system of commerce or justice. It was very restrictive.
And did you think you'd have the ability to influence that at all, or not?
I did, and in hindsight, I think we've made significant progress. One of the things that I was trying to figure out was how do we wean the Saudis off of extremism and get them to feel more of a part of the international economic and even maybe political community.
Mm-hmm.
And they had been wanting to join the World Trade Organization for some time. And under the Clinton administration, Clinton was busy getting China into the WTO, and they didn't have time for it. So I decided to make this a priority. And I talked with Condi Rice about it. She thought it was a good idea. I went to see Vice President Cheney in Washington about it.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see Don Evans, who was the Secretary of Commerce, and they all agreed that this was something we should elevate to a priority level. Armed with that, I then went to the U.S. Trade Representative, Bob Zoellick, who had been resisting all along because he had staff limitations. They were exhausted from China and so forth. And I basically said, hey, Bob, the White House, Secretary of Commerce, all of these, the Vice President, everyone wants us to do this. Do you think we can get this done? And he sort of rolled his eyes at that point and said, okay, yes, we will. And so over the next several years, the Saudis were required to pass a lot of fairly progressive legislation, completely changing their insurance code, their commercial code, allowing for commercial courts, implementing more of a rule of law. And so then by about 2005, they had finally qualified to join the WTO. Now, by this time, I had come back to Dallas, and we had a new ambassador there. But one day during that period, my phone rang, and it was the new ambassador, Jim Oberwetter, and he said, Bob, I'm here at the WTO headquarters. We're signing up the Saudis for the WTO, and I just want to pass the phone around the room, let everyone here congratulate you for having gotten this underway. So it was a wonderful feeling of accomplishment. And so, yeah, there are things you can do. It takes a team, though, to do it. And we had some great people both on the Saudi side and on the American side. And the WTO was very helpful to us in Geneva as well.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
The Israel-Palestine conflict was very present at that time, 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
20 years later, bigger deal than it was then, the same, worse?
Well, it's like Groundhog Day in many ways. It is probably worse now because even at the height of what is called the Intifada, the resistance, which started, the second one started in 2000, there was still a notion of some restraint on each side. But the October 7th attacks this year reached just a complete new level of violence, brutality, atrocity that we hadn't seen. We hadn't seen it certainly from the Palestinians to this extent. It was more akin to what ISIS has done over the past number of years. So it has gotten to a point where pretty clearly neither side believes that the other side deserves to live there in peace. And so I think it is much worse, and it doesn't seem to have any ending point right now. Even if Hamas is militarily defeated, the ideology of Hamas will not be defeated, particularly if repressive and extremely aggressive tactics are imposed against the civilian population.
Mm-hmm. What has to happen to get it to a better place?
Better leadership, I think, on both sides, on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. Netanyahu is kind of captive right now to an ultra-right-wing cabinet made up largely of pretty aggressive settlers who want to take over the West Bank, want to drive the Palestinians even out of the areas that the United Nations has assigned for them under international law. This is becoming a really difficult situation in that cabinet. So that cabinet's got to change. Probably Netanyahu needs to leave. And then on the Palestinian side, it's very similar. Mahmoud Abbas was elected to a 4-year term something like 16 years ago, and they haven't had an election since. And he's 87 or so. He is not interested in being a leader. He is corrupt. His administration is corrupt and doesn't even have the respect of the Palestinian people. So we've got to find somehow leadership on each side that's willing to take some risks. And that will, to some degree, not be that popular with the extremists on both sides.
You know, I sit here from America like a lot of, my friends do, and we see all these videos on social media. Every morning I wake up, and it's one of the first things I see is a horrific video.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We can't even imagine. We're so lucky in America that we've never had to see this on our soil.
Yeah.
But it feels so hard to move the needle or to impact it.
Yeah.
Like, do you have any advice for what we can do to help from such a far distance?
I think we need to be informed, and sometimes social media is the worst source of accurate information. We can't just develop our opinions of the world based on TikTok, and it requires being discerning about what kinds of media we allow to inform us. And I think having a broad access to various sources is probably the best choice here, rather than simply sitting in an echo chamber. Second, I think we've got to have political leadership, both in the United States and in the international community, that recognizes that this is simply an intolerable situation, and hard choices have to be made by both sides. What I've said in the past is each side has to change their national narrative. Each side right now considers itself to be the victim of the other. And therefore in an existential battle for survival. And they are, in many ways, the ones who made it so. And so it's going to take something that breaks that cycle of hatred, distrust, and hopelessness. And certainly the Palestinians feel a sense of hopelessness now, partly of their own making. But half of Gaza right now is made up of young people who never once voted for Hamas in the elections of 2005 or 6. And so to say that they're equally guilty because they're Palestinians is a form of collective punishment that is just not appropriate. So we've got to get beyond that. The Palestinians have to get beyond the fact that, yes, the United Nations in 1948 did give Jews a state, and the Jews have a right to have a Jewish state. But it doesn't mean that there aren't ways to organize both societies with adequate, if not ideal, surroundings. It's never going to be ideal when two cultures emanate from the same geographical area, and it's a small area. Israel is a small country, and Gaza and the West Bank are small pieces as well. So they're going to have to find something, but the leadership, I think, has to lead.
Okay. I read your book, Desert Diplomat. It was such a fun read. So thank you for this entertainment. One of the moments that stood out to me was when you were in the Oval Office with President Bush, and he informed you that America was likely going to go to war in the Middle East with Iraq specifically.
Right.
Do you remember your initial impressions of that moment, and did they change and evolve?
It was a staggering moment. When I finished that meeting, I went out to the State Department car that was going to take me back to the State Department and pulled out a note card. I just wrote down, I think I wrote down December 12th, as he put it, we're fixing to do a regime change in Iraq. And I just I said, for me, this is a historic moment for me to memorialize, and then I need to figure out exactly how to deal with it, because he said the Saudis were not all that keen on an invasion. They felt that we would be creating a vacuum that would allow Iran to then insinuate itself into Iraq, partly because they had many Shiites living in Iraq. But he said to me that he wanted me to be his point man with the Saudis to get their approval. We needed access to Saudi air bases, to Saudi border crossings into Iraq, Saudi intelligence, and we also needed Saudi cover, if you will, with the Sunni Muslim world to not undermine what we were trying to do there or make it any kind of a religious battle. And so that was a fairly great responsibility. And I, of course, then went back to Riyadh very quickly and started working with my team to make all of that happen. And it involved a lot of negotiation with my own government because, as is typical in government, you get a little bit of overreach. For example, the Pentagon wanted the Saudis to allow us to close all their commercial airports and have all of our military assets scattered around the commercial airports in addition to the military bases. Well, I knew that was something they were just never going to agree to. Some other things like that. So I went into the Minister of Defense and I said, here's what we can do for you, but here's what here's what I don't think you're going to ever agree to. Mm-hmm. And they said, yeah, we're never going to agree to that. And so I, of course, reported back up the chain to make sure that everyone understood what we could get and what we couldn't. The good news is that the Pentagon was very skeptical the Saudis would give us any of that, and they thought they would be a tremendous obstruction to our ability to undertake the invasion. And as it turned out, we got, as the Rolling Stones said, you can't always get what you want, but you can get what you need, and we got what we needed.
Nice. What do you recall as the most tense moment of your post?
May 12, 2003. I'll never forget it. I was sitting in my residence, and the phone rang about 10:30 at night, and they were reporting to me that 3 Western housing compounds in Riyadh had been attacked by suicide bombers, and there had been enormous casualties. And so I raced to the embassy. We called an emergency meeting of our country team. I went to some of the hospitals to see the wounded, and I made a number of condolence calls to Americans whose loved ones had been killed. And I had received some intelligence a few weeks before that Al-Qaeda for the first time was actually thinking of an operation within Saudi Arabia. Up to this point, they'd gotten a lot of funding from individuals in Saudi, and had hesitated undertaking operations there. But we were getting intelligence that might be changing. And so I actually sent 3 letters to the Crown Prince and the Minister of Interior saying we need more security at Western housing compounds. And they had ignored me. So this really infuriated me when we now saw the attacks. But it coincidentally happened that Colin Powell was on his way to Riyadh that night for a previously scheduled meeting with the Crown Prince and with me. And so I went with Powell to see the Crown Prince and the aftermath, and we're still assessing, the level of brutality and damage that we'd experienced. And the Crown Prince turned to me and he said, Mr. Ambassador, before we get started, I want to apologize to you. You had asked for more security, and I didn't think you needed it. It was my decision, and I was wrong. And we're going to, he said, I can assure you from this day forward, we're going to go after these terrorists. We're going to go after anyone who has given them aid or comfort, or even anyone who tries to justify what they did. And sure enough, from that moment on, they became a much stronger ally in fighting Al-Qaeda and fighting terrorism than before. And I also went on Ted Koppel's show Nightline that night and several other American TV shows, and they kept asking me, what happened? And I told the story of asking for more security and not getting it. And so we had some initial unhappiness with the Saudis, but the Crown Prince, to his credit, stuck by his promise to me and insisted that his people start cracking down even more harshly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was quite sobering. Yeah.
Making calls to the loved ones of the deceased.
Yeah.
Is something I hope I never have to do.
Yeah.
That takes a hero. So thank you, Bob.
Well, thank you.
The stress that you had to go through all of that, I would imagine was quite tremendous.
Yeah.
How did you manage that? Like right? When people are going through stress, do you have any tips or advice on how to process and handle that in a healthy way?
Communicating with friends and colleagues and confidants is important. You really can't keep those feelings bottled up. The weekend in Riyadh was Friday and Saturday. Friday was the day of prayer, and so all businesses were closed on Friday. And we had what we called the Friday group, and that was a group of other ambassadors, one of our CIA officials, and a couple of other expats from other countries. And we would get together, and I had a tennis court on my station, in my residence, and the Belgian ambassador had a tennis court at his place. So we would go back and forth, playing doubles tennis. We'd have a few drinks. Our Marine Corps security guards had a bar in the embassy called Uncle Sam's, and it was the only place that you could actually get alcoholic beverages. And we were very careful in monitoring how much people bought. It was a package store. You could buy alcohol, and then you could also have a drink at Uncle Sam's. But because it was outlawed in the rest of the kingdom, we wanted to be respectful of their rules. But at the same time, a U.S. embassy is actually American property, and so we were able legally to be able to do that. And that was a nice outlet. We would have a few parties from time to time. We would have our National Day, which of course here is the 4th of July, but because July is unbearably hot in Saudi, we would make our National Day in February. And so I decided we needed a Texas theme for our National Day, and asked some of our party planners to make some longhorn steers out of styrofoam and let them float in the swimming pool. And then we had 800 guests who showed up, including many Saudis and other expats. And we gave each of them a straw cowboy hat and a red bandana. And it was hysterical to see all of these Saudis in their white robes coming in with a bandana and a cowboy hat. But so you break the tension some ways like that the best you can. You also get out occasionally, home leave maybe 3 or 4 times a year, going to meetings like I did in Geneva for the WTO, other meetings in Washington, of course. And that helps break a little bit of it as well.
Yeah, break the tension.
Yeah.
That's such good advice.
Yeah.
I think. Wow. Amazing. I feel like one of the things that allowed you to be so successful is your ability to build relationships. You're building relationships with crown princes of Saudi Arabia. I think most of us are just trying to land a date at the coffee shop.
Right.
But there's got to be some similarities in kind of the process. Are there certain things that you think are critical to building a good relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Making sure that you get the other person's point of view, showing respect to their point of view. I often say that other countries besides the United States get to have a national interest also. And a lot of the times we will be critical, for example, of the Saudis and their decisions on curtailing oil production or something like that. But we have to keep in mind, they see their oil production decisions as a part of their national interest. And they're not in existence just to serve our national interest. So part of diplomacy is finding where those national interests intersect and taking advantage of the intersection, but at the same time, moving each side a little closer in the areas where they don't intersect. Or sometimes it's just transactional. You just say, okay, we're just going to have to agree to disagree on this particular point. So listening is very important. In fact, when I first arrived in Saudi, I met with all the other ambassadors in town, one-on-one, the whole diplomatic corps. And I'll never forget one of the ambassadors. I said, so what advice do you have for me? He said, a good ambassador has 4 ears and only half of a tongue. And so that was a signal, at least certainly in the first few months I was there, to do more listening than talking. And you never learn anything from talking. You learn from listening.
Yeah.
And so then if you're well prepared, it also helps. Sometimes misunderstandings occur because one side or the other is engaging in mythological thinking and really doesn't have the facts straight, but is sort of basing their decisions on some notion of reality that isn't accurate. And so you have to be prepared enough to help straighten that out.
Did people start to treat you differently once you got your ambassadorship?
Yes.
Like, I'm curious, the people in Dallas, your community, how did they start to treat you?
Very affectionately and respectfully, almost immediately. When I was just about to leave for Riyadh, I came back to Dallas, and the Dallas Bar Association, which I had been president of a few years earlier, threw a large party for me. And people who used to call me Bob then started calling me Ambassador. And I felt it uncomfortable at first. It was sort of like, hey, this is Bob talking here, you know.
I'm the same person.
Yeah. And they gave me a massive scrapbook of all the things that we had done together and photos over the years and things. And it was a tremendous outpouring of affection. And of course, this was after 9/11 now, so they also realized the stakes were pretty high. And I would have other people call me, say in tears, saying, don't go over there. It's too dangerous. And I said, look, I've committed. I'm going to do this. And so it was a mixture of things like that, but it was enormously supportive. Yet at the same time, there was just a little bit of distance created by calling me by a title instead of Bob or whatever else jokingly they might have called me in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if it got lonelier.
I think but it did in a way. I mean, I still had a close group of friends who didn't really do that, but it was a different feeling, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah. And in Saudi, I mean, you really were like the second most powerful person there.
Yeah. Some people have written that. The American ambassador generally has a lot of influence. In some cases, more than is accurate. So, for example, there's always a tremendous interest among the Saudis in who their next crown prince is going to be, because it's not a vertical line from one father to a son. It's among brothers who are peers and contemporaries and rivals to some degree. And so the question was always, when I was there, when will they go back down to the next younger generation? Because it was a bunch of guys in their 70s and 80s at this point. And I can recall being at a dinner party at a Saudi home when they raised the question, what are we going to do? And I said, well, what do you want to do? Who do you want to be your next crown prince? Well, it was reported the next day that I was basically urging them to reject the senior royal who was most likely in line for it. And I said, why did you think this? And they said, well, the American ambassador can make anything happen. And it showed how, in a way, yes, they believed the American ambassador was more powerful than was accurate. But they were also very tense about it. And they held us to a standard, I think, of omnipotence that made it difficult for us to make decisions or to explain decisions sometimes. As I said earlier, they thought President Bush could snap his fingers and make the Israelis make peace with the Palestinians. That's just not reality. And the same thing goes for the American ambassador. I couldn't pick their next crown prince if I wanted to.
Mm-hmm. There's this impression that Saudi is very extravagant.
Yeah.
In some regards. Mm-hmm. Is that true?
Yes.
What was it like rolling up to, your first palace or getting your first gift, maybe?
It was staggering. I remember one moment when Vice President Cheney came over, and we rode together in Air Force One, which was called Air Force Two when he was aboard, but it was the same plane the president uses. And we flew into Jeddah to see the king and the crown prince. And they presented him with this massive gold Rolex watch. And they presented me with, I think, a silver or stainless steel watch of some kind. And of course, you can't accept gifts like that. But that was just a tiny inkling of the kind of wealth that you would see on display. One of the sons of the king had a palace outside of Riyadh, which was essentially a Saudi version of Williamsburg. It was created to look like a 1,000-year-old Saudi village with artisans making pottery or machinery or things for horses, saddles or whatever. And I can recall Senator Joe Lieberman came over, and we went to the village to see all of this at about 11 o'clock at night. So they had insisted that all these workers essentially be working while we went there for a very late dinner and strolled through this village seeing all the artisans doing what they did. And it got cold, of course, at that moment. And so they came out with robes. Again, they had a mink robe for Senator Lieberman. They had a sheepskin robe for me. And I was able to keep that because it was appraised at less than $250.
What happens to the watches?
We gave, I don't know what the vice president did. I turned mine into the State Department, and they have a...
What do they do with it?
Well, it's actually been reported that a lot of these gifts that are given like that are used by the FBI in sting operations. For example, the ab scam, there was an ab scam scandal many years ago, and I think some of the undercover people wore elaborate watches and elaborate dresses and costumes and things as part of that sting operation.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
What's Air Force One like?
It's pretty cool. Had
you been on a private jet before that?
Yeah.
Okay. Wasn't your first jet experience?
But it's very large. It's a 747, so it's a 707, I guess, but it's very large. Up front is the president or the vice president's quarters, and then there is an office or conference table. And the further back you go is where the staff people are, and then the furthest back are the press. And in the middle is essentially a back office of computers, copying machines, all the sorts of things that you would have in a regular office, except it just happened to be in the air. And so I would sit with maybe a couple of cabinet members and a general or this in captain's chairs facing each other, where we could have discussions with a table between us. And then when the vice president wanted to see me, I would go into his essentially office / sitting room, and we'd sit on sofas and talk at that point.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Norah Jones, Come Away With Me. What does that mean to you?
That was my ringtone on my BlackBerry, I think it was at that time. And I made the mistake of not leaving it behind when I went in to see the vice president in the White House in his office at one time. And it rang while I was in there. And of course, that was a very embarrassing moment for me. But from a security standpoint, you never want to take a cell phone into a secure space of any kind. But I had recorded the Norah Jones song partly because she went to the Arts Magnet High School in Dallas, which is where one of my sons had gone. And so she was a big star there, and I was always a big fan of her music.
What did Cheney think about it?
He was not amused, but I've never seen him amused by very much. So
he got kind of a flat personality.
Not much reaction.
What was the biggest surprise of all your whole experience with the government?
A couple of things. I was surprised at how dysfunctional some parts of our government are. There was a lot of backbiting, a lot of factions, even within the senior levels of the administration. And you would have, for example, rivalries between much of the Defense Department and the State Department. You would have rivals even within White House advisors' offices with each other. And in some ways, it's healthy to have discussion, but when it starts to undermine what actually is trying to be accomplished by others, then I think that's a problem. As an example, when we were having a summit meeting in Crawford with the Crown Prince and the President, the Saudis had what they called 8 deliverables they needed from that summit meeting. You usually have deliverables, in other words, things that you're going to announce jointly that you've accomplished. And much of that is done by staff work before the summit meeting. Well, the Saudi ambassador delivered those their written list of deliverables to the White House. But I was then told that the vice president's office intercepted that list and started working on them themselves through their own foreign policy people, rather than having the National Security Council and the White House working on it, or even letting the State Department know what had happened. And so that kind of stuff really did surprise me. I wasn't prepared for that. I guess the second thing is I was tremendously impressed at the political neutrality of most of the career diplomats, foreign service officers, and military people that I worked with. They were true patriots. Even if it wouldn't have been a policy they would have initiated themselves, they salute and say, "Yes, sir," and off we go. I worked, for example, with Bill Burns, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for the Near East. He's now the head of the CIA, and he served under Republican and Democratic presidents. He gives you the same advice no matter what side of the aisle you're on, and I was surprised at that and tremendously gratified.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Is there advice that you pass on? You know, you're teaching now at SMU, and I'm sure you get to talk to a lot of people. You're a commentator on CNN and CNBC, right? These different news outlets. Is there any general advice that you like to give to people?
Be curious, be informed, travel, learn something about the world, and remember that other people have a right to their point of view, and we have to still live in a world in which it can't be just our way or the highway. We have to find accommodation where it's necessary. We have to stand firm where it's necessary, and understanding that distinction is quite important.
Mm-hmm. That's great. What do you feel like has been your biggest motivating factor for everything that you've done?
I guess a sense of purpose, as a desire to get things done. It's not a checklist necessarily, but you want to feel at the end of the day that you've had an impact, that you've gotten something accomplished, and that you did it the right way.
Mm-hmm. What would your younger self from Wichita and Oklahoma, what would he think about this insane life? You know, from Saudi to Air Force One to the Oval Office. What would he say about all that?
Well, I've somewhat analogized it to Forrest Gump. I mean, I've been exposed to so many amazingly memorable things in my life, met so many interesting people, had so many opportunities along the way. It really is. It's hard to describe how I could have even imagined something like that sitting in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Mrs. Sterling's third grade class.
Yeah, it's pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
Well, we'll wrap it up here. I think there's a lot that we didn't get to, but we hit a lot of the key points. I would encourage everyone to read Desert Diplomat, the book that's out on your life. It's a fascinating read. You know, talk about your 3 kids a little bit. You working in Dubai for how long?
4 years.
4 years. A lot of good lessons from that. So, Bob, anything else that you'd like to cover?
Great to be with you. Wonderful questions. Thanks so much.
Such an honor to have you. So thank you a lot.
Enjoyed it.
Yep. That's it. Thank you so much for tuning in to Permission to Shine, the podcast dedicated to sharing the most humble, inspiring stories that I know you will love. Again, this is Andrew Nemani. I appreciate you tuning in. As always, please reach out. Please follow on Instagram, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple. Leave us your thoughts. Let us know who you want as a future guest or what's your takeaways from this conversation. We'll talk to you soon. Have a great, great week.